We open with an elegant, upscale restaurant bustling with activity. The camera pans across the dimly lit space. Polished wood floors, flickering candlelight, and the gentle murmur of refined conversation. She walked in unnoticed, an elderly black woman, dignified yet unassuming. No one in that restaurant expected her presence to expose a hard truth, one that would bring the entire room to a stunned silence. The camera lingers on the entrance. The woman steps inside, her posture straight, her movements measured. She wears a navy blue coat, embroidery at the cuffs, and carries a small, elegant handbag. Her face is lined with wisdom, her eyes carrying a quiet strength. But while she walked in with grace, what she encountered was anything but. The hostess greets her with a forced smile, one that barely disguises a flicker of hesitation.
Do you have a reservation, ma'am?
Yes, under the name Mrs. Johnson. Softly, yet firmly.
The hostess scans the list, her lips pressing together. She nods and gestures toward a table. But it's not one of the well-lit, spacious ones near the center of the room. Instead, she leads Mrs. Johnson toward a dimly lit corner near the kitchen. A seat at the edge, out of sight, as if she didn't belong. Mrs. Johnson doesn't react. She sits, folding her hands over the menu, waiting. But as minutes tick by, it becomes clear. Something is wrong. Cut to a wider view of the restaurant. Servers move with precision, attending to guests with warm smiles and quick service. But not to Mrs. Johnson, period. She sat, waiting. Other guests, some of whom had arrived after her, were already being served. Their drinks were poured, their orders taken. Yet she remained unseen. A tall waiter, mid-20s, well-groomed, named Ethan, finally walks by. He barely glances at her, then walks past her table, again and again, without stopping. Finally, he approaches. His expression neutral, but his tone clipped. Ethan, waiter.
Sorry for the wait. We're really busy. I'll be back in a bit.
He turns and leaves before she can respond. Mrs. Johnson takes a breath. This isn't her first time facing something like this. She recognizes the signs, the sidelong glances, the dismissive tone, the avoidance. She watches as Ethan laughs with another table, taking their order with enthusiasm. His smile comes easy with them. But when he passes her again, his expression tightens. A nearby couple whispers, "Woman," softly glancing at Mrs. Johnson's table.
She's been sitting there for a while. Why hasn't anyone taken her order?
Her partner shrugs, but looks uneasy. Some noticed. Most didn't. But the ones who did, they said nothing. Ethan returns, empty-handed. No water, no menu suggestions, no courtesy. Ethan, waiter. Forced smile.
Look, we're a little understaffed. Might be a while before I can get to you.
Mrs. Johnson holds his gaze, her face unreadable. Then she gives him a small nod. Mrs. Johnson, calmly.
Take your time.
Ethan smirks, walking away. But someone has been watching this entire time. Cut to a table near the bar. A man, early 40s, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, leans back in his chair. His expression is calm. Too calm. His eyes, however, are sharp, watching Ethan closely. His fingers tap rhythmically against his glass, observing, calculating period. This man is Michael Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson isn't just any customer. She's his mother, and he owns this restaurant. He had built this place from the ground up. Every detail, every design, a reflection of the values his mother had instilled in him. And now, watching her be treated like she didn't belong, that was personal. But he doesn't move, not yet. He wants to see how far Ethan will go. More time passes. Mrs. Johnson lifts her water glass, only to find it empty. Nearby, a guest receives a fresh glass of wine. A small frown crosses her face, but she remains still. Then, Ethan passes by again. She gently raises a hand to get his attention. Mrs. Johnson,
Excuse me.
Ethan sighs, barely hiding his irritation. He turns. Ethan, waiter, curtly.
Yes?
Mrs. Johnson.
I'd like to place my order now if you're not too busy.
A moment of silence. A test. How will he respond? Ethan rolls his eyes, exhaling loudly. Ethan, waiter.
I'll be back in a minute.
He walks off. Michael places his glass down. That was it. Enough, period. He stands, smoothing his suit. The restaurant shifts. Some patrons sensing the tension. He walks across the room, measured, calm, until he reaches Ethan, who is casually joking with another table. Ethan notices him too late. He turns, surprised. Ethan, waiter. Nervous laugh.
Oh, hey, Mr. Johnson. I didn't realize you were here tonight.
Michael, owner. Calm, but firm.
I've been here, watching.
Ethan blinks, unsure. Ethan, waiter.
Watching what?
Michael, owner. Nods toward his mother's table.
Watching you ignore my mother, who's been sitting there for almost 30 minutes. No water, no service, nothing.
Ethan's face drains of color. He looks between Mrs. Johnson and Michael, realization setting in. Ethan, waiter, stammering.
Your mother?
Michael, owner. Sharp, controlled anger.
Yes, the woman you decided wasn't worth your time. The woman you thought didn't belong here.
Silence. The restaurant is now fully tuned in. The pianist stops mid-note. A waiter standing near the bar shifts uncomfortably. Ethan swallows hard, but Michael isn't done. Michael, owner.
Save your excuses. Everyone here saw what happened, and now you're done.
Ethan freezes. Then, after a long pause, he unties his apron and walks out, his steps hurried, face burning with humiliation. The restaurant watches as the door swings shut behind him. Silence hangs for a moment. Michael turns to the manager, Dana, who has been hovering nearby, unsure if she should step in. Michael, owner, steady voice.
Dana, take over table 12 and make sure my mother has everything she needs.
Dana nods quickly, hurrying over to Mrs. Johnson's table, refilling her water glass with trembling hands. Michael takes a slow breath. Then he walks toward his mother, crouching slightly by her table. Michael, owner, softly.
You okay, Mom?
Mrs. Johnson meets his eyes, smiling gently. Mrs. Johnson, warmly.
I'm fine, son. You handled that well.
Michael remains crouched by his mother's table. The tension in the restaurant lingers, but Mrs. Johnson's expression is calm. She reaches out, gently patting his hand. Mrs. Johnson, softly.
You did good, son. You let him show who he truly was before you stepped in.
Michael exhales, rubbing his temple. There's a weight in his voice. Regret, frustration. Michael.
I should have stepped in sooner.
Mrs. Johnson, smiling slightly.
Number, you gave him a chance to do right. He chose not to.
Dana, the manager, returns with a menu. Her face still flushed with embarrassment. She places it in front of Mrs. Johnson, speaking with sincerity. Dana, manager.
Mrs. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. That behavior has no place in this restaurant. Please, anything you'd like, it's on the house.
Mrs. Johnson looks up, offering a small, understanding smile. Mrs. Johnson.
Thank you, dear. But I intend to pay, not for the meal, but for the principal.
Dana hesitates, nodding respectfully. She steps back, giving them space. Meanwhile, at a nearby table, the couple who had been whispering earlier exchange glances. Woman, shaking her head.
I still can't believe he did that.
Man, thoughtfully. Makes you wonder how many times this happens when no one is watching. Michael overhears the exchange as he stands, straightening his jacket. He walks past their table, pausing for a brief moment. Michael, owner, calm but firm.
It happens too often, and too many let it slide.
The couple nods, absorbing his words. Michael returns to his table, watching his mother from afar. The restaurant has resumed its quiet hum. But the energy is different. Staff move with more awareness, as if the weight of the moment still lingers. Tonight wasn't just about one act of discrimination. It was about the silent choices people make, the ones who saw but did nothing, the ones who knew but ignored it, and the ones who finally chose to act. Cut to Mrs. Johnson, now being served her meal by Dana. The warmth in Dana's gestures is a stark contrast to Ethan's cold indifference. The staff watches carefully, as if making a silent vow to never let something like this happen again. Michael leans forward, deep in thought. For Michael, this wasn't just about his mother. It was about what his restaurant stood for. A place of dignity. A place where everyone belonged. Flashback montage. Michael as a young boy, sitting in his mother's small kitchen, watching her cook with love, her voice guiding him, instilling values of respect and integrity. Mrs. Johnson, flashback voice.
A good meal can bring people together, son, but respect, that's what truly makes a place worth coming back to.
Back to present. Michael's jaw tightens. He knows what he has to do next. Later that night, after the restaurant closes, Michael gathers his staff. The team stands in a semicircle, exchanging uncertain glances. Dana stands beside him, arms crossed. She knows what's coming. Michael, owner, firm, controlled voice.
What happened tonight is unacceptable, and not just because it was my mother, but because it was a guest. Someone who deserved the same respect as anyone else who walks through these doors.
A young waiter swallows hard, nodding. Michael, owner.
Ethan made a choice, and now, so will we. If any of you think what he did was okay, speak now.
Silence. Michael, owner.
Good, because this isn't just about one mistake. It's about culture. If we don't actively stand against this, we allow it. And I won't allow it.
He glances at Dana, who steps forward with a clipboard. Dana, manager.
Starting tomorrow, we're implementing training sessions on service ethics, equality, and respect, non-negotiable.
The staff nods, their expression serious. Because change doesn't just happen in grand gestures. It happens in the small, daily choices. The ones that define who we are. As the staff disperses, Michael walks into the quiet dining area. Mrs. Johnson is still there, sipping tea, waiting for him. He sits across from her, exhaling. Mrs. Johnson, gently teasing.
I hope you didn't fire your entire staff.
Michael chuckles, shaking his head.
Just one.
She nods approvingly. Mrs. Johnson.
And the rest?
Michael.
They'll be better.
She studies him for a moment, pride shining in her eyes. Mrs. Johnson, softly.
You built something special here, Michael. But never forget, places like this don't just serve food. They serve experiences. They serve dignity.
He nods, absorbing her words. Michael, genuine.
I won't forget, Mom.
She finishes her tea, standing with ease despite her years. Mrs. Johnson, smiling.
Good. Now, walk your mother to the door.
Michael laughs, standing up and offering his arm. As they walk toward the exit, the remaining staff watch, some still shaken from the events of the night. Outside, the night air is cool. Mrs. Johnson pauses before getting into the car, turning back to look at her son. Mrs. Johnson, seriously but warmly.
Not everyone will see what happened tonight as wrong, Michael. Some will say it was just a mistake, just one waiter. But tell me, was it just one waiter?
Michael looks back at the restaurant, then at her. He understands. Michael.
Number. It was a mindset, and mindsets need to change.
She nods, satisfied, then steps into the car. Michael watches as it drives away, standing under the streetlights, deep in thought. Cut to the empty restaurant, chairs stacked, lights dimmed. Tonight, a woman walked into a restaurant expecting a meal. Instead, she was served a reminder that respect isn't always given freely. Sometimes, it has to be fought for. And the question isn't just what Michael did about it. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have noticed at all? Because these moments, they happen every day. The real test is whether we choose to see them and stand against them. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience in silence. Words appear on the screen. What would you have done? Followed by, if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share. These conversations matter.